I'm going. I'm going to relate a personal example. One day when coming home from university, I actually started a conversation with my parents about the Plains of Abraham. I was in history. I was taking a university history course, and I was learning about the battle, but also about the Battle of Saint-Foy. Most people don't know about the Battle of Saint-Foy, which was in April 1760, after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. This was actually a French victory. And it became very, very evident talking with my parents that my father, who had been educated in French parochial schools, had been taught a very different history about what had happened from my mother, who had been educated in the English language schools, public schools of East York. And it actually got quite animated. It was quite interesting to see it, fists on the table and a parent going, no, this is what really happened. And this is something that struck me, that in both cases, these basic details of what happened were the same, but the interpretation of them, what was highlighted, what wasn't highlighted, was very different. Myself, I was actually educated in the English language system, and I had never actually heard of this battle. Now, one of the challenges of the heritage field is that the idea of heritage is a very powerful concept. And the idea of heritage can be used for a variety of purposes, not all of which are positive. Indeed, some understandings of heritage have been used as tools for oppression, have been politicized, and have been used to reinforce very particular understandings of the past. I have a subscription to a publication called Early American Life. And Early American Life, it focuses upon the built heritage in the US and culture in the US. And in one of the previous issues, they had talked about the burning of Washington during the War of 1812. And then had referenced the protests in January. And they actually had to print a statement in the following issue saying, this was just discussing the history. This wasn't meant to be a partisan comment. And we have to recognize that notions of heritage have been used to reinforce very particular understandings of the past, including what is important and what should we conserve. The Australian Laura Jane Smith has turned the construction of these sort of formalized and institutionalized narratives or understandings as authorized heritage discourses. So put it another way, the issue is not the act of protecting cultural heritage resources, it's how we protect, including what we choose to protect or not, how particular legislations and processes privilege or reinforce certain interpretations of what is important, and I'll come back to that, and what narratives and interpretations we choose to highlight when communities protect something. Think, for example, of when we write these statements of cultural heritage, value, and interest. What are we putting into them? So about, I'll say over 25 years ago, I was actually training for a career in law and international affairs, and was taking a course in peace and conflict studies. One of the courses in this program, which has really stayed with me, was run by an actually practicing therapist and was focused upon what he termed identity-based conflicts. In this course, we discussed the ways in which identity can exacerbate a conflict, particularly if issues of identity are ignored or marginalized. Now, as I learned more about the heritage field, particularly thinking about the shift to values-based heritage, identity-based heritage, one of the lessons that I really learned was that despite our origins as focusing often upon the materialistic or fabric aspects, heritage at its core is about people. It's about issues of individual and group identity. And it is really important. And people really value it and are really concerned about it. However, this is one of the reasons why conflicts over heritage resources can be so significant, can be so explosive. These resources, for some in our community, represent a fundamental element of their own or group identity and worth. But we must recognize that these resources may have very different and often negative meanings for other people. Thomas King, and this is actually about 20 years old now, and I think it's still really relevant. He wrote that when we ignore such values or insist on their expression only in terms with which the dominant culture is comfortable, we fuel frustration and anger. Robert Palmer, who was the director of from the Council of Europe, he actually went a little further, and this was at the time of the creation of a document called the Fore Convention, which I'll talk a little bit about. He said, we have to recognize that heritage in itself is not simply a public good. Indeed, it has often been the basis for conflict. There is much evidence in the past and also today of heritage as a divisive force if it becomes a tool for resistance and the expression of difference. So it has to be recognized that not all narratives can be reconciled. I had the privilege of working with the government of Ontario a couple of years ago to revisit the Statement of Cultural Heritage, Value and Interest for Ste. Marie among the Hurons. And we actually had 3 Indigenous groups that expressed an interest as part of our duty to consult. You have 3 very different histories, which don't align to what we would say is the traditional Western record. And as part of our learning process in this, we had to come to acknowledge and say, yes, there are differences. Yes, these don't reconcile. But this is the understanding of the past by these communities. And we have to recognize that. That is how they understand their past and their heritage associated with the site. One of the ones that was particularly telling was actually the Métis Nation of Ontario. And the first question that we had was, well, why is the Métis Nation of Ontario interested in Ste. Marie among the Hurons? And we sat down with them, and the first thing they slid over was a land registry map and survey, which showed that Ste. Marie among the Hurons, the reconstruction, was built on the site of a Métis village in the historical era. And they said the village actually replaced the area where several of the Métis families lived. So this was something that was really, forced me personally to think a little differently about this. Now, these sort of understandings have been informed really by a strong, I'd say the last 5 years. I'm not sure why, I'm going to apologize. I'm not sure why my presentation keeps jumping. A growing body of literature on human rights and the ethics of practice. A lot of this material has really been in the last 10 years, and it's quite remarkable about how it's pushing heritage professionals to look differently at what we do. And one of the key documents that has highlighted this is called the Fore Convention, properly known as, I have to read this name. It's, the Convention on the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society. And it has very different aims from what some of us may expect to see or do within the heritage field. And it's right now only in place in Europe, but it's informed a lot of ways that we are thinking about this. And the aims are to recognize that rights relating to cultural heritage are inherent in the right to participate in cultural life, as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have to recognize individual and collective responsibility towards cultural heritage. And to emphasize that the conservation of cultural heritage and its sustainable use need to have human development goals and the quality of life as its focus. I was, shortly after this, about 5 years, I was in Portugal at a conference. And this is a World Heritage City in Portugal, just north of the city of Porto. And the heritage planner was speaking to us, and he said, what do you think our #1 issue is? So this is a room full of heritage experts. So we're all throwing up our hands. We're saying, negative impact from tourism, negative infill, too many tourists. And we went on, and he let us go for a couple minutes. And then he said, my #1 issue is plumbing. He says, when the World Heritage designation came to our city, 1/3 of homes did not have plumbing. So he says, we are now in a situation where water is a basic element, a basic human right. And we are now having to try and figure out how we fit this in with the current statement of significance and the heritage values identified for this community. And that, for many of us, really made us think about, what are we focusing on? This understanding, as I say, is informing a much more critical approach to the heritage field. I'll put it another way. Robert Stipe, who is a very prominent historic preservationist in the US, he wrote in his book, A Richer Heritage, we cannot protect stuff at the expense of people. So heritage is about what we want to conserve because we think it's important. However, do we as community members stop enough to question, who is the we, determining the how, why, and what? As the geographer David Lowenthal notes in his work, The Past is a Foreign Country, we always have to view the past through our lenses, a process which is dynamic and does change with the needs of society. So, as I mentioned, many of us here today are members of municipal heritage committees from across the province, myself included. And while others play different roles, one of the things that has struck me in my 20 years of working with heritage committees is that our groups, our organizations, our committees are often the very public face of not only heritage conservation, but also municipal government. For many people, their only interaction they will have with a government body at the local level is through a heritage committee. Further, as community volunteers, we are meant to represent the public interest in heritage and advise council accordingly. As I often tell my students, words and actions have power. The policies and process we help create can have very lasting repercussions. And I have an image, this is from John Lehman, this was in the Globe and Mail. This is from a potlatch in British Columbia. And the outline of certain acts, such as the potlatch, has had a negative impact on communities on the West Coast. And indeed, it's this recognition that laws, policies, and process can not only protect, but again, can alienate. These are going to be very difficult for some people to read. I've been very lucky to have colleagues who will push me to be more careful in language and approach, to think differently about issues, and to reflect on the use of specific words and phrases and how they can be considered inappropriately. For example, even in the title of my presentation today, one of the panelists saying, well, should you be using the word inclusivity rather than equality? She said, inclusivity suggests you're giving permission for us to join, as opposed to working with us on an equal basis. And I would say, have we as a community done enough to actually think about the words we say and how we say it? And I would really say no. So I have been amazed at the comments I have heard personally by MHC members, representatives of heritage organizations, people speaking at public meetings, and indeed from very well-meaning heritage supporters. And these are just a sample of comments I have heard myself. Most of these are direct quotes. I do have the sources. Some I have modified to protect the community or perhaps an individual involved. But these are things that have been said, often at public meetings, often at MHC meetings. The first example, newcomers like you need to learn how to respect heritage. This was said to a native-born Indo-Canadian who was questioning why his property was being designated. Indians are an apologist culture about the need to actually engage with Indigenous communities. We need to protect colonial architecture. Again, an example of a marginalized community member asking why their property was being designated. I am glad I am working with a white heritage planner. I was told this directly. I don't see why we need to do an acknowledgement. The land is owned by the Queen in any case. This was actually an example of federal property. And I just basically had to say, have you heard of the duty to consult? Why are they putting their name on our history? And this was an example that really struck me. This was actually in Kingston. A longtime Jewish family was sponsoring a municipal heritage asset. And this came up about why is their name being put on it? You're gay, aren't you? Aren't many heritage people gay? That was actually said to myself. And my response to that was, does it matter? And the response was quite right there. The following one, this was actually at a committee of adjustment meeting. I actually got a formal reprimand for this. We had actually required an archaeological assessment, and the property owner stood up and said, there were no Indians on my land. There was just that old couple who lived down in the cabin by the water. And for those of you familiar with the term WTF, I just about said the full statement in the meeting towards the chair. I was shocked. We don't talk about the bad stuff that happened. We focus on the good stuff, like architecture. This was a very recent comment about a site where sexual abuse had happened. And the last one, young, brash, and enthusiastic. That was actually used in a newspaper article to describe myself. Despite the fact I was 36, with a doctorate, was a senior planner, and was teaching heritage planning. Now, I've actually, in talking to my colleagues as part of this panel, I actually received a whole series more, which I really didn't want to put up. Some of them were so foul. I could not, in good conscience, repeat them. I just was shocked that we are still seeing these types of comments. The two other examples I want to share. This was actually part of a heritage conservation district process. And the person who wrote this, I know them quite well, was very well-meaning, was really trying to support the heritage district process. And in the newsletter, they wrote, a pivotal question is what does the proposed designation of the district mean for property values and property uses? Does this create an area that is beyond the economic reach of many? Yes, but that is the price of preservation. Like antiques or good art, the value ensures the preservation of the asset. Heritage housing also retains value in market downturns and is not as volatile as speculative building stock. If heritage housing had no more value than any other housing, it would be, well, history. This was hand-delivered to every home within the proposed Heritage Conservation District the day before a public meeting, including the 30% rental and affordable housing units. This quote has been used by opponents of heritage districts in Eastern Ontario to point and say, here, this is why we don't want heritage districts. And the last one is a really interesting case, and it was a really challenging case for me personally. This is a former synagogue in a major Ontario city. We were hired by the congregation that currently occupies it. It is now occupied by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So they received a notice of intention to designate, and the congregation hired us because they didn't know what it meant, and they wanted us to help them through the process. And a couple of things really struck us very early on. The description of the property referred to it only as the former synagogue. It didn't acknowledge the community that had been there for 30 years, and the community had questions. And one of the things that came out very, very quickly, the community was predominantly Black and Haitian, and many of the members were poor. They said, why are they doing this to us? Do they not think that we can actually protect it? And it was the first time that I had heard that type of a concern expressed to me directly. So we talked with the community, we talked with the church, we talked with the headquarters in Oshawa. And we went back to the municipality and said, okay, We have some changes that we would like to see, but could you, in the historical associative values, acknowledge the 30-year history this community has with this building? And the heritage planner we were working with said yes. But it went up the line and someone a little more senior came back and said, well, 30 years isn't an association that's long enough. We pushed back. We said, okay, this is easy for you. Add them in. So after a back and forth, they were added in. The community was still upset about the designation, but the headquarters in Oshawa they're like, listen, we understand the act, we understand the process, the property meets the criteria. We're not going to object. We went to the Heritage Committee meeting and the designation for this property passed. The very next property proposed for designation was being designated because of an association with a Canadian poet who had lived there for 2 years and whose writings are now being critiqued as being a little bit racist. What's the message that's sent to this community where they had to fight for the right to have their 30 years acknowledged when the very next designation protected it because someone had lived there for 2 years? This is some of the types of messages we have to think about in the work that we do. So I recognize in my experience that many of these views, many of these concepts represent a very small minority. And my experience with the heritage field is most of us don't think this way. Many of us want to learn. Many of us want to see how we move forward. But the fact remains, these comments that I have shown and these examples were spoken in public forums, often without reprisal, reprimand, or even a formal response. And this paints a very, in my experience, a very unflattering picture of the heritage field. We are already challenged by a number of myths and misconceptions about what we do. And I would argue that we have an ethical and moral responsibility not to let such comments go without some form of a response. If we are promoting equal participation, we must ensure that all people feel encouraged and safe to speak their perspective and understandings, and that people really do have an equal opportunity to participate. For those of us who are on the session today, who are members of heritage committees, professional organizations, community organizations, and even council members, most of us have very clear codes of conduct. And I would encourage all of us to read what those code of conduct say and look at our requirements for running of meetings. And I can assure everyone here that the failure to abide by these codes will lead to issues in the future. And I know for a fact that some people are already looking at some of these examples. So then, and I've been actually asked this a few times, if you're being so critical, if you think that there are these problems, why do you still support heritage? The answer for me is simple. I think heritage is fundamental to healthy, sustainable, and resilient communities. I think it's a fundamental part of the democratic process, human rights, and social justice. I believe there are tremendous opportunities to move forward. Jody Wilson-Raybould, in a recent speech at Queen's University, stated she'd like to use the term allies rather than settlers. And I was really sort of struck by her use of this language. To me, in many ways, it suggests a mutually beneficial relationship that requires honesty and openness and intent to listen and willingness to learn from each other. Some of us also need, as I've been told more than once, to park your privilege at the door. My grandfather was functionally illiterate. He had been removed from the school system in grade 3. But despite that, he was the sole income earner for his family, a single parent of 6, a labor organizer, and a master machinist. And he taught my father, and my father really has reinforced this lesson. never underestimate anyone because they have a particular schooling, a particular background. We all can make a meaningful contribution, no matter who we are, and we can all learn from each other. So in a talk like this, I can't possibly provide all the answers, nor would I think it's actually appropriate. However, there's some really important observations I can make for all of us to consider. The first, and this sounds like a really obvious statement, sitting here in the third wave presenting at a virtual AGM from an empty office, this seems like a really obvious fact that COVID has changed things. However, COVID has also amplified social disparity, has given time to be more critical and reflexive, and indeed has resulted, as some of people around here can probably attest, some questioning of how our government and our processes work. COVID did not create the issues that have led to many of the protests regarding heritage sites. However, it has, in my opinion, served as the breaking point for many communities who have been ignored, marginalized. As the September 2020 commentary in the journal Infectious Disease bluntly states, racism, not race, drives inequality across the COVID-19 spectrum. We need to recognize that there are issues of systematic racism across Canada. We have to recognize how we, in some cases, have been the beneficiaries of a particular privilege. And this refers not only to the opportunities afforded to us, but to the barriers that didn't hamper us. We must also be committed to learning about what changes need to occur. And this has not been an easy task. And some of people who have raised some of these issues, trying to move a conversation forward, have suffered some really nasty ad hominem attacks. And this is from The Guardian late last year. A university professor was hired to review a number of the sites under the National Trust. She identifies that a number of these sites did have clear links to slavery. Particularly if you go to some of the big manor houses, there was a question of where did the money come from to build them, and was actually attacked. A lot of people were saying, well, you're only promoting a political agenda, and was actually finding that people were trying to discredit her, to attack her in her university position. And in this case, this was not the only person to experience this. So let's jump to some of the issues in Canada. Well, I would argue probably almost all of us have heard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I would challenge all of us here today to ask if we've actually read the recommendations in the call to action. It's only 15 pages, but the 94 recommendations in those 15 pages speak to many different aspects of the Canadian society. And there are some very specific recommendations that are key for the heritage field. If you haven't done so, I would encourage you to read it and consider how at a local level we can support these recommendations in a meaningful way. Now, this hasn't been the only report, and this is one I'm going to be very honest, I had not heard about. And this was from the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner. And this was in 2017. They actually issued a human rights report on Canada's historic treatment of people of African descent. And it was actually only through a segment on CBC that I learned about it. And as someone who works in this field, is focused on some of these issues, I was surprised that this information had not been more widely disseminated. And the report identified a number of concerns with systematic racism against Canadians of African descent. And amongst its key recommendations were revisions to heritage programs to ensure a wider understanding of the history of this community. And these are just three that I've highlighted. Preserves by establishing monuments, legally recognized as a distinct group, the issuance of an apology, but also ensuring that our textbook, educational materials, and I'd even argue things like the statements of cultural heritage, value, and interest, reflect some of these historical facts. Now, the history of slavery in Canada is not really well understood. We are very, very quick to point accusingly at our neighbors to the south. But slavery in law was not repealed in Canada till 1834. You had legislation passed in the 1790s, but people could still legally own slaves up until 1834. Now, coming from Kingston, and this is, I really give a lot of credit to this organization. This is the Lower Burial Ground Restoration Society. We actually have slave burials here in Kingston, and the Lower Burial Society has been working to, dedicated to the conservation of the site, has been working to understand and interpret this aspect of the community's past. And they actually have worked with Black historians to try and point to other sources to identify. It's the recognition that, there may be others, the issues that were unresolved, and, talking a little bit about this and starting to highlight this. Yet, I also know of 2 other sites, local sites, designated under the Ontario Heritage Act, where there were documented accommodations for Black servants. Yet, in reviewing much of the formal documentations and even the interpretations for some of these sites, this acknowledgement of the history is never referenced. It's not even identified. Kelly Black, who works in the British Columbia, had a very timely article entitled "Explaining Settlers to Ourselves, Rethinking Interpretive Narratives at Heritage Sites." And he provides the following plaque from Point Elise House in British Columbia. This historic residence, built in 1861, was the home of Honorable Peter O'Reilly. As Gold Commissioner, County Court Judge, and member of the first Legislative Council of British Columbia, he was prominent during the formative years of our province. This graceful house was the O'Reilly family home, or the O'Reilly home, for more than a century, and remains an example of mid-Victorian charm. How many of us have seen designation plaques like this? This reads like a lot of our designation bylaws. He is a guide of the site, and he talks about how they've actually been using this plaque to reinterpret the history. He says, there was a very simple fact that there's a problem with this, and it's of what it omits. Peter O'Reilly, for 18 years, was the Indian Reserve Commissioner for the province. It's the only one of his jobs not listed. The omission was not accidental. It was a deliberate effort to focus upon the more positive aspects of the site. And Black really drives the point home. He says there can really be no reconciliation without truth. And as members of the heritage community, we can be committed to this process, even when it makes us uncomfortable or clashes with our own individual understanding or lenses. However, this is still an evolving process. There's still a lot of work to do. I don't want to say that we have sorted this out at this point. This is actually a plaque from British Columbia. There's been a lot of talk today in the heritage field about decolonization. I'll read the plaque. To the victor goes the signs. Erasure of Indigenous lives in British Columbia public history is dangerous because it works. Things terra nullius, the empty plains doctrine that justified the theft of the New World. A public-fed Indigenous-free history is fed doubt about the depth and intensity of pre-contact occupation and skepticism about Indigenous rights and title. Narratives that deny the extent and severity of colonial injustice being rationalized ongoing marginalization of Indigenous people. This is actually, they've taken the traditional British Columbia heritage plaque and they've actually remade it with new text. And this is a project they're doing in British Columbia right now. However, this process, though, of decolonization is not well understood. This is the First Peoples Council, Cultural Council. This is a 2020 publication called Recommendations for Decolonizing British Columbia's Heritage-Related Processes and Legislation. And for me, it gives a definition that is a useful starting point for discussion. Decolonization requires significant, if not radical, rethinking, of relationships and changes in structural authority, processes, and procedures. It is thus very difficult to accomplish because it requires those holding power to relinquish at least some of it. Decolonization employs established or emerging methods and strategies that seek to shift the power structure, restore Indigenous cultural heritage sovereignty, and otherwise upset the colonialist status quo. These include, but are not limited to, community-based participatory action research, ICH management practices, community-initiated and led projects versus collaborative or participatory ones, embodied practice in story work, restorative justice, social justice, and more. These in turn require new modes of research ethics and the application of free, prior, and informed consent. Such requirements have significant implications in the context of ICH preservation and research, particularly in the context of sacred places and burial grounds, oral histories and Indigenous knowledge, and individual or group identity, worldview, history, and well-being. Now, this was focused upon Indigenous perspectives, but many of the ideas would apply to different colonized peoples. Among the recommendations from this document was that there must be a recognition that a marginalized community's history and resources belong to them. To expand the existing focuses of heritage work from just the materiality and tangential nature of cultural heritage resources, to recognize that intangibility is just, if not more important to some communities. To allow communities to develop their own regulatory and protective regimes. And we're actually seeing some of this in Ontario already, where some communities, Indigenous communities, are identifying their own archaeological requirements. And to ensure greater cross-government cooperation. Now, British Columbia was also the first province to adopt legislation based upon the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And some of you may have heard of the ongoing discussions in Parliament. There is a process, the British Columbia has already adopted legislation based upon the United Nations Declaration. The federal government is in the process. It is a controversial project. Several provinces have objected. The federal government said, no, it is proceeding. But also some Indigenous communities have objected, saying, we're not clear on how you are actually going to implement this with us. Now, the United Nations Declaration contains 45 different articles. Now, you may have heard the term UNDRIP. I had the opportunity to work with a British Columbia chief who works with this legislation, and he said, don't call it UNDRIP. He says, it sounds like something that comes out of a tap. He says, call it the Declaration or use the full name. But there's a couple of really key articles, and this is Article 11. Indigenous people have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestation of their cultures, such as archaeology and historic sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts. And state shall provide redress through effective mechanism, which may include restitution developed in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws and traditions. I want to pause there. There was actually a really good talk through the Ontario Museums Association on working with Indigenous communities about artifacts. And you had a presentation from the museum at Haida Gwaii, and they were relating the story that the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has one of their cedar chests. And they said, we wanted it back for a potlatch ceremony. It cost them $50,000 to bring it back, and they had to pay for 2 of the curators to come with the chest to make sure that it was properly cared for. When it was actually put in the potlatch room, the first thing that the curators said to the community was, well, you have it backwards. We have it the other way around in the museum. To which the elders said, no, you're the ones who have had it backwards on display all these years. This is how we actually use this item. And it was a wonderful discussion about that difference about understanding some of these items. Article 15, Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their traditions, of their culture, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. Again, like the call to action, I would recommend everyone read this document. The implications of the legislation is still being debated, but from everyone I've talked to, regardless of the outcome, it will change how we in the heritage field operate. It will have profound aspects on certain parts of the heritage field. However, how we engage in this process more widely will be challenging. The structure of heritage legislation in Ontario has traditionally been fragmented into different types of cultural heritage resources, making it very difficult to undertake a holistic approach. The Ontario Heritage Act does not regulate use, nor does it allow for the protection of chattels. One thing that struck me is the 2020 changes to the provincial policy statement and the definition of significant will, in my opinion, prove problematic. I'm surprised it hasn't already proven problematic, as it identifies only the provincial processes and criteria as the official arbiter of what is significant. So in 2014, the definition was, in regard to cultural heritage and archaeology, resources that have been determined to have cultural heritage value and interest for the important contribution they make to our understanding of the history of a place, event, or people. In the 2020, processes and criteria for determining the cultural heritage value and interest are established by the province under the Ontario Heritage Act. And I think, are you going to say to a traditional knowledge keeper that you haven't formally done an OREG 906 assessment on your site, therefore it's not significant? These are things I think we are going to have to address as we're moving forward. So this is another example. This is jumping back to Ste. Marie among the Hurons. When we were working with the community there, one of the communities, one of the things they said to us is they'd like the statement of cultural heritage value and interest to reflect the archaeological artifacts that had been removed from the site. Unfortunately, under the Ontario Heritage Act, we couldn't include those because they are chattels. So one of the things that we did is we talked about it is that we believe that these are significant. We believe these contributed to the significance, but you have a framework that doesn't actually allow for some of the things that some communities are seeing as fundamental to be formally recognized in this way. So the question we are left with is whether our existing framework still works. This is a much larger question that can be addressed today. But still, we can consider the policies we write, the processes we create, and the histories we formalize. And we do need to start this discussion. One of the issues I'm often asked about is the renaming or removal of monuments in place. And I'm asked about this on, I would say, almost a weekly basis. In 2020, the second edition of our textbook, Heritage Planning, was published. And as I note to my students, it's already outdated. Much of the writing we had done in 2018. And as part of the update, my co-author and I had many discussions about how to consider the removal of monuments and the renaming of places in the text. At the time, our recommended approach was for interpretation rather than removal, to contextualize the monument, to recognize that there can be issues of presentism, which is the reinterpretation of these sites through our contemporary lens without actually understanding the context in which it was created. However, in the last 3 years, a lot has changed. And for myself, including how I've come to understanding the significance of such monuments. In late 2020, Smithsonian Magazine published a piece on how just adding commentary or context is not always sufficient. As the author Aaron Thompson wrote, people on all sides of these debates have been arguing that removal isn't necessary. Instead, we can just add signage to remind viewers of the history and the people left out by the monuments. This is the approach the National Park Service is taking towards the hundreds of Confederate monuments on its sites. Even though some of these monuments have been controversial for decades, The Park Service websites promise that these works and their inscriptions will not be altered, relocated, obscured, or removed, even when they are deemed inaccurate. Instead, the Park Service intends to add signage to explain the causes of the war to visitors, emphasizing that slavery was a key part of the dispute. However, there's a wonderful new book that has come out. It came out late last year, Emotional Heritages by Laura Jane Smith. And within this, there was a lot of research done, thousands of interviews done with actually visitors to these sites. And the findings was that the reality is that less than 3% of visitors acknowledged that their perspective had changed as a result of these efforts and these signage and this reinterpretation. The reality is that most people still use these sites to reinforce what they already knew and believed. In 2019, Canada's History published a piece by Nell Ostrom on the current discussion about and debate about renaming and monument removal in Canada. And within this article, A.G.B. Johnson, an East Coast historian and former Parks Canada employee, was quoted as saying that this process is not new. And this is the quote: "It strikes me that sooner or later, all societies look critically at their history, and by implication, their commemoration. Across the Americas, this is definitely one of the moments." And the removal or support of particular monuments really echoes across history. These are just a couple of examples. In ancient Egypt, you actually had the recarving of monuments by later pharaohs to obliterate certain pharaohs, to recast it in their image. The image on the lower right was actually during the American Revolution, where you had a number of people pulling down the monuments to George III. And as I mentioned before the talk today, the formal talk today, you are seeing the removal of monuments in places like Russia now being returned and restored. And this is one of the great examples that I like to refer to. This is the tomb of Cyrus the Great. This is one of the earliest recorded heritage conservation projects in world history. This was restored by Alexander the Great. And it was restored not for a love of heritage, but as a very political move, as a very clear statement. And we have to understand that monuments and statues were constructed with a particular intent. They are symbols. Some of you know Dr. Brian Osborne. He's actually written quite a lot on this. There's a reason why they were erected, and were meant to commemorate a particular history event in a particular way. However, being trained as a historical geographer, one of the first lessons I learned was that meanings associated with places change, as do the values of societies and communities. Places are not static, and in periods of transition, we reevaluate and reconsider ourselves as individuals and communities. We also question and debate the values of symbols of past belief systems. This is the process that is actually currently occurring in our society. So what do we do? As a result of one of my consulting projects, I was faced with the issue of considering what is an appropriate use of a site of dark heritage, also known as a place of pain or shame. And one of my learning activities was actually to engage with an organization called the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, which offers some great training opportunities and webinars related to issues of contested heritage, marginalized communities, social justice. They actually have a whole training series on what do you do with statues, what do you do with monuments. At the time with this site, I also started working with an Indigenous elder who has helped me understand some of the different perspectives on how such sites should be addressed. And one of the first things she said to me was that I had to learn to listen to those most affected by these places and sites. Particularly with sites of pain or shame or conscience, the future of the site should be determined by those who have experienced the trauma related to it. And the outcome is not one size fits all. Using the example of residential schools, some communities have chosen to demolish them, where others have reclaimed the structures to tell their experience. And Woodland Cultural Center is one of those examples where they have reclaimed that space. And this was my personal experience with the prison of women. When we were doing the designation, we received a community request for the designation. And I got called into a senior staff member's office. And he said to me, why the hell will you want to protect this place? This is a bad place. We should be tearing down this place. Who thought of a quest to protect a place like this? And my response was, the request was actually made by the former guards and inmates to make sure that their experiences were not lost. This means there are no easy solutions. It requires a case-by-case consideration of the different interpretations of sites and monuments and what the affected communities see as the appropriate action. It should not be assumed that there will be a particular outcome. It should not even be assumed within communities there will be a singular perspective. And while this process and these issues may seem daunting, I see them as an opportunity for us all. This is the time to challenge how many people view this field, to show that we are committed to equality and diversity, and that we are ready to learn and listen, and that we are willing to change. Thank you.